Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening.
You read it right. He had checked out an hour earlier, probably having gotten wind of something, feeling unsafe, and quickly left. How dare Michael not heed Jared's warning, blatantly doing things he knew very well that they were against the law. Claus looked up with a gentle smile, but his eyes had an inorganic coldness. He called and told Jared what he found and some of his own interpretation, as if he had witnessed what happened with his own eyes. He's good for nothing but tattling, emboldening Michael even. A long silence was on Jared's side before Jared was heard saying, "One at a time." Claus then hung up and was thrilled. One at a time, everyone gets their turn. Boss has his own reasons for doing things, and I'm not in a hurry. Meanwhile, Nicole had walked Mrs. Wallace Sr. into the Riddle mansion to meet her parents. It was her eldest brother who picked her up the last time. Daniel and Gloria had never met Mrs. Wallace Sr. yet, so she had to take Mrs. Wallace Sr. to meet them. When Nicole brought Mrs. Wallace Sr. into the living room, they happened to see Daniel and Gloria come downstairs. Gloria looked at Nicole and Mrs. Wallace Sr. in surprise. She quickly went up to them and whispered to Nicole, "This is..." Seeing Nicole nod, Gloria and Daniel's eyes lit up. They walked excitedly to Mrs. Wallace Sr., took her hand, and said softly to her, "You must be Nicole's grandmother. We have long heard Nicole talk about you and thought of visiting you in Great Oak to thank you in person. We did not expect you to come first." Daniel also grinned as he looked at Mrs. Wallace Sr., and from time to time, nodded in agreement with what Gloria had said. Mrs. Wallace Sr. did not expect Nicole's parents to be so friendly. She felt touched and waved her hand. "I just miss Nicole, wanting to see if she is doing well. Now I am relieved to see you all so friendly." Gloria quickly reached out and held Mrs. Wallace Sr.'s hand while winking at Nicole. "Your grandpa is waiting for you to accompany him to take his medication." Nicole knew they wanted to chat with Mrs. Wallace Sr., so she nodded gently and said to Mrs. Wallace Sr., "I'll be right back." Mrs. Wallace Sr. did not stop her from going, but looked at her with an avuncular expression. "Good girl. Go." She and Gloria sat down and chatted on the couch. Nicole only went upstairs when she saw they were getting along well. Mrs. Wallace Sr. told Gloria some funny stories about Nicole's childhood. The three of them sat in the living room. With Nicole as the common topic, the conversation did not feel awkward at all. After learning about Nicole's habits, favorite food, and things that would offend her, Gloria finally asked cautiously, "Will Nicole blame me for abandoning her for so many years?" Mrs. Wallace Sr. seemed to have expected this question. She glanced at Gloria and sighed secretly. "You have to ask Nicole about this. She knew a lot of things and kept everything to herself since she was a child." Seeing Gloria's face sunk, Mrs. Wallace Sr. added, saying, "Nicole must love you too very much. Otherwise, she wouldn't have stayed in the Riddle family, judging by her personality." Hearing this, Daniel and his wife's eyes lit up. They looked at Mrs. Wallace Sr. with a tinge of gratitude on their faces. They were too blinded by their emotions, and it was Mrs. Wallace Sr. who made them realize the actual situation. Mrs. Wallace Sr. looked at Gloria and asked her a question. "You found a daughter before Nicole, didn't you?" Gloria and Daniel looked at each other, and both bowed their heads in shame. Nora was angry and did not come home for a few days, so Gloria was worried about her. 2 nights ago, she heard a servant say Nora had come home but just took a look and left afterward. No one knew why she did not enter the house, but Gloria was thinking of visiting her in school if Nora still did not come home in 2 days. Daniel also sighed when Nora came to mind. It was all because they did not conduct a DNA test that they mixed Nora up with Nicole, which was equally hurtful to both Nicole and Nora. Mrs. Wallace Sr. saw that they were genuinely sorry for Nicole. It had been a great dereliction of duty as parents for them to find Nicole back only after so long. Mrs. Wallace Sr. was thinking of reproaching them. But seeing their guilty faces, she, at last, said nothing. No parent did not want to have their children growing up beside them. Daniel and Gloria must have been very painful to lose Nicole by negligence at that time. The disappointment that came after realizing that they had mistaken someone else for their daughter did not help either. The time and effort they had spent and the amount of distress must be huge. so there was no need for her to harp on the issue again. Mrs. Wallace Sr. sighed again. She looked at Daniel and Gloria and said solemnly, "You may give Nicole freedom, but you must also hold her hand and lead her to the way home. You only need to be good to her, and she will reward you endlessly. So you must treat her well." Daniel and Gloria nodded assuredly. Mrs. Wallace Sr. smiled with relief and still wanted to say something. Just then, the door suddenly opened, and a surly voice came from the outside. "How can you allow any Tom, Dick and Harry to enter the Riddle mansion?" It was Dylan. He walked in, circled around, and sneered at the quaintly dressed Mrs. Wallace Sr., who was sitting at the table. Only then did he sit down on the sofa on the opposite side, cross his legs, and say to Daniel, "Aren't you afraid of making yourself a laughingstock by inviting a garbage collector into our house?" Dylan appeared triumphant. Daniel looked at him with unconcealed anger on his face. "You can mock me, but please don't get Nicole's grandma involved." What? This old lady was the person who raised the brat. The malice look in Dylan's eyes was all too obvious. He almost laughed out loud. "Why can't I talk about her? She dressed so badly. Isn't she a garbage collector?" Gloria could not bear his insults and stood up. "Dylan, I respect you as my brother-in-law, but please respect others and don't spew your insults." Gloria's words hit him where they hurt the most. Dylan went from humiliated to angry, jumping up, wanting to slap Gloria. "You batch! How dare you say this to me?" Karen, who had returned to visit Mr. Riddle Sr., had just gone downstairs and could not help but frown when she heard the noise in the living hall. She had not spoken to Dylan lately because Dylan had humiliated her in front of everyone last time. But then, she also felt she could not bear to watch her husband being bullied and do nothing. So she rushed down the stairs. "Are you crazy, Gloria? How dare you insult my husband? Believe me, I'm going to tear your mouth off." Amid the chaos, a commanding voice suddenly came from upstairs. "Cut it out." Dylan's hand was being grabbed by Daniel, and Karen was frozen in her posture of rushing toward Gloria. All of them turned around stiffly. "Dad!" Everyone was looking up at the stairs. They could not believe their eyes when they saw Mr. Riddle Sr. on his feet. Nicole helped him walk downstairs. Her brows furrowed when she saw her grandmother standing there being bullied. However, it was heartwarming for Nicole to see Gloria standing in front of her grandmother protecting her. Dylan and his wife tried to look normal as they did not want to act rashly in front of their dad. A hint of disappointment flashed upon Mr. Riddle Sr.'s eyes as he looked at Dylan. Mr. Riddle Sr. was furious with Dylan, his hands trembling. Dylan was quite loud just now. So, Mr. Riddle Sr. heard everything as he walked down the hall. Dylan was way out of line. How could he say such awful words to Mrs. Wallace? Dylan did not look as proud as before when he noticed his father's face was contorted with anger. He quickly sat upright and forced a smile as he looked at his father. "How are you, Dad? Are you feeling better? Why did you come down?" Karen was disgusted by her husband's reaction. How can Dylan still be so afraid of his dad? Even though Karen was not happy with her husband's reaction, she flinched the moment she noticed her dad was furious. She quickly withdrew her hand and stood behind her husband. Mr. Riddle Sr. grunted as he looked at the both of them. "Why did you ask? Were you hoping that I wouldn't be on my feet ever again?" Dylan kept quiet as he knew whatever he was going to say would only upset his father further. However, he was disgusted by the way Mrs. Wallace Sr. dressed. He twitched his mouth in a grimace and voiced his displeasure. "Dad, don't be mad at me. Look at what Daniel did. How can he bring someone dressing like a beggar into our house?" Nicole's face darkened when Dylan called Mrs. Wallace Sr. a beggar. Mr. Riddle Sr. noticed her emotion rather quickly and patted her hand to comfort her. He then turned around and glowered at Dylan. "You were so rude to Mrs. Wallace Sr. Apologize to her now," said Mr. Riddle Sr. "What? Did Dad just ask me to apologize to a beggar?" Dylan stood still. Mr. Riddle Sr. squinted. "This brat doesn't even listen to me now. Does he not respect me anymore?" Nicole helped Mr. Riddle Sr. walk toward Dylan. Although Dylan heard his father loud and clear, he still refused to apologize to a beggar. He believed that his father would not embarrass him in front of outsiders no matter what he did. It was probably just for the show. While Dillian felt pretty confident about his own thought, a sudden gust of wind whooshed from behind him. He then felt a sharp pain in his knees while he was still processing what was happening. "Ah!" screamed Dillian. A powerful blow dropped him to his knees, making him look wretched and embarrassing. "How dare you kick me, Nicole?" Dillian instinctively assumed Nicole must be the one who kicked him because she had almost made him kneel back then. The fact that he did not have to kneel in the end did not lessen his shame, however. "It must be Nicole trying to put me in embarrassment again." "You still have the nerve to call Nicole? You deserve being kicked," said Mr. Riddle Sr. Dylan's face turned pale as he was harshly reprimanded by his father. "Dad actually let Nicole kick me. He doesn't even bother that I'm an elder family member and put me in a tight spot." Karen could not help to speak. "Dad. No matter what, Dylan is still an elder member of the family." As she said that, she ran to Dylan, wanting to help him up. But Mr. Riddle Sr. said in an icy cold voice, "Don't any of you dare to help him up." His words had startled Karen. She immediately drew back her hands. Mr. Riddle Sr. looked at Dylan's eyes. They were full of shock. He said indifferently, without a trace of pity in his voice, "I repeat, apologize to Mrs. Wallace Sr. now." Dylan did not expect Mr. Riddle Sr. to want him to apologize to Mrs. Wallace Sr. He looked at Mr. Riddle Sr. and then at Nicole, who was staring him down. He could barely hide his resentment. However, he knew that there would be no end to this if he did not apologize to her. So he could only keep his head low while enduring his anger and said, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. Damn Nicole. It's all because of her that I have to humble myself to apologize to a filthy beggar," thought Dylan, who was glaring at Nicole with hateful eyes as though he had wanted to skin her alive. But Mr. Riddle Sr. thrashed the ground with his walking stick and frowned. "What face are you showing her?" Mr. Riddle Sr.'s action sent Dylan shivers. He immediately lowered his head, trying to hide his facial expression. On the other hand, Nicole did not miss the resentful look on Dylan's face while watching the scene. "Uncle Dylan must be holding a grudge against Grandma and me. Grandpa is here now, so Uncle Dylan has no balls to harm us. But what if when Grandpa is not around?" There was a ruthless glint in Nicole's eyes. Only when she retracted her gaze to Mrs. Wallace Sr. and saw her grandmother's comforting smile did the frost in her eyes thaw. Mr. Riddle Sr. thought Dylan had sincerely apologized, so he no longer stopped Karen from helping Dylan up. He walked to Mrs. Wallace Sr. with a smile on his stern face. "So you're Nicole's grandmother?" Mrs. Wallace Sr. nodded. She could tell that the man before her was the head of the Riddles. She had thought him to be a strict person, but now she noticed that he seemed to highly regard Nicole. At the thought of this, Mrs. Wallace Sr. no longer felt worried about Nicole. "Yes. And you must be her grandfather," said Mrs. Wallace Sr. with a gentle smile. Mr. Riddle Sr. nodded. "You're right. Thank you for taking care of Nicole all these years. It's a pleasure to have you in San Joto. Please stay with us for dinner." Once he said that he asked the kitchen to prepare meals. After that, he said to Daniel, "Call everybody. Tell them to get here to welcome Mrs. Wallace Sr. There's no need for that." Mr. Riddle Sr. Mrs. Wallace Sr. kindly declined the treatment. She felt that someone like her did not deserve such an effusive welcome from the Riddle family. However, Mr. Riddle Sr. held a different opinion. "You shouldn't have felt this way. Nicole's family is my family. It's a rare chance to finally have you in San Joto. Why not you stay here for some time? We can show you around." Dylan's facial expression distorted when he heard Mr. Riddle Sr. "No way I'm gonna stay with this old beggar under one roof. This is the Riddle residence. Even Karen and I only get to stay here for a few days every month. Who is this old hag to get special treatment?" Karen held the same thought. But when she was about to speak her mind, Mr. Riddle Sr.'s words came to her mind. In the end, she could only swallow her words back down her throat. Now that Mr. Riddle Sr. was pissed, and they did not want to defy him, they had no choice but to leave Nicole alone for a few more days. Mrs. Wallace Sr. was here just to check out the Riddle family's attitude toward Nicole. Mr. Riddle Sr.'s attitude was clear, so she had nothing to worry about. She was not used to staying in such a ridiculously large family, and it did not help that Mr. Riddle Sr. asked her to stay longer. Mrs. Wallace Sr. wanted to decline, but was worried that her refusal might affect the Riddle family's opinion of Nicole. Just as Mrs. Wallace St. was in a dilemma, Nicole said deprecatingly, "It's all right, Grandpa. My grandma isn't familiar with this place, and I'm going to sit for exam soon. I'm afraid I will not have time to accompany her. Maybe when Grandma comes next time, she can stay here longer." Upon hearing what Nicole said, Mrs. Wallace Sr. let out a long sigh of relief. She turned to Mr. Riddle Sr. "Yeah, it's so courteous of you to invite me to have a meal here. I don't want to trouble you again. Anyway, thank you very much," Mrs. Wallace Sr. said with a nod of thanks. Mr. Riddle Sr. did not insist. He smiled and nodded back. "It's all right. How about we start dinner now?" He felt Mrs. Wallace Sr. kind and congenial when he saw her. "Okay." Mrs. Wallace Sr. nodded obligingly. Everyone agreed, and Daniel and his wife had a smile on their faces. Dylan was also relieved simply because he did not have to live with this old lady. "I didn't expect Nicole's grandmother to be so unappreciative of Dad's kindness, just like Nicole. She befits the person who raised Nicole. The two are equal fools." Unlike Dylan and his wife having an axe to grind each, Nicole stood by her grandmother's side and talked to her. Mrs. Wallace Sr. whispered to Nicole, "Thank goodness you spoke for me. Otherwise, I couldn't have refused it." Nicole looked at her cute grandmother with a faint smile in her eyes. "No sweat. I know you don't like staying in other people's places." Having lived with Mrs. Wallace Sr. for so many years, no way Nicole did not know that Mrs. Wallace Sr. disliked life in big cities. Besides, she did not even live in the Riddle family now. Mrs. Wallace Sr. would feel uncomfortable staying alone in her grandfather's mansion or her parents' house. Coupled with the fact that her aunts and uncles were not that friendly, she was worried that her grandmother would be bullied. Given Mrs. Wallace Sr.'s character, she would definitely grin and bear it even if she was wronged. With this thought in mind, Nicole's eyes became gentler. After saying a few words with her parents, she and Mrs. Wallace Sr. sat down on her grandfather's left. Mr. Riddle Sr. had a casual chat with Mrs. Wallace Sr. soon. The clock hands in the hall were pointing at 6 p.m., but his grandsons had not arrived. He frowned, upset that they were getting more and more unruly. Just as he started to get angry, the door opened, and Nicole's 5 brothers all hurried in. Sean had met Mrs. Wallace Sr. before. Seeing her at the dining table, he quickly brought his brothers over and greeted her. "It's my pleasure to see you here, Mrs. Wallace Sr. You're Nicole's grandma? You look so young." "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Wallace." "Nice to meet you." Steve, Stanley, and others greeted Mrs. Wallace Sr. in tandem. Samuel was the last to speak. He scratched his head and said awkwardly, "I'm sorry, I'm late." Steve and Sean also nodded. They had just arrived from the office and happened to meet their 3 brothers coming back from school. Mrs. Wallace Sr. looked at the young lads, seeing them stand at Sean's side, and guessed that they should be Nicole's brother. Looking at faces which had reddened from running, she did not want to say anything but waved her hand to show that she did not mind and motioned them to take their seats. Nicole saw her brothers sitting down next to her and knew that they had set store by her and thus accepted Mrs. Wallace Sr. and that they wanted to let Mrs. Wallace Sr. know that she had not been mistreated in the Riddle family. That was why they took time out of their busy schedule to come back. Thinking of this, Nicole felt her emotion surging. Samuel sat next to Nicole and winked at Nicole, who looked at him with a smile in her eyes. At 6:10 p.m., the door was opened again, with Preston coming back from outside. Karen quickly motioned him to sit down beside her to have dinner. But Preston ignored her. Instead, he pulled out an empty chair on one side and sat by Mr. Riddle Sr.'s side. Mr. Riddle Sr. said nothing when he saw this. Instead, he instructed the dinner to be served, as he would not wait for his other 2 sons. It was not until the start of the dinner that Damien and Dexter arrived, followed by Ella and Emery, but none of Damien's kids were following him. Just as Damien wanted to take a seat, his face sank all of a sudden when he saw Preston sitting in his seat. "Preston, why are you sitting here?" asked Damien, as he was the only person qualified to take that seat all along. Preston did not look at him but took out his mobile phone and played games with the headphones on, blocking himself from hearing Damien's voice. Damien was infuriated. but he was not a fool like Dylan. He quickly got his emotions under control and turned to look at Mr. Riddle Sr. "Dad, are you letting him be just like this?" he asked with a questioning tone. He remembered Mr. Riddle Sr. had always indulged his children. But Mr. Riddle Sr. seemed to be not too unhappy with him today because he was late. He ignored Damien's question and casually knocked on the table. "You're late. What is the problem with the child sitting here with me? Don't be so calculating," he said with little emotion, and then picked up the cutlery, obviously unwilling to hear Damien say more. Damien's hands clenched into fists, his expression a little grave. He then looked at the old lady and Nicole sitting across from Mr. Riddle Sr. He somehow noticed that his position in the family had begun to wane. He went from being the one to whom everyone looked up to being lesser than the kids, probably even more insignificant than an old lady in rags. Damien was furious, but he gritted his teeth and sat down next to Dylan. Dylan did not mind that, as Preston, who was sitting beside Mr. Riddle Sr., was his son. What is there to complain about? He thought. Karen also had no intention of calling his son back. After all, Preston seemed to have become close to Mr. Riddle Sr., which was not a bad thing for her and her husband. Thinking of this, Karen smiled with her lips pursed. She looked at Damien with a hint of mockery on her face. "Why don't you take it as a break from having to serve Dad?" Karen asked. Damien did not want to argue with a woman. He was deep in thought, with his face darkening. Miley, on the side, did not hear the undertone of what Karen said. Clueless about what happened, she looked at Karen and then at her husband, trying to persuade him. "Exactly, Damien. Dad is still sick, and it could be contagious. Having a change of seat isn't a bad idea after all." Damien's face sank even further upon hearing what Miley said. He took a deep breath and then turned to look at Miley, who knew nothing about what happened in the family and only wanted her daughter to become a star all day long. She simply sounded incomprehensible to him when she said such stupid things. "What do you mean by changing sitting position is not a bad thing? Don't you know what that seat means? I'm afraid that after this meal, my position in the family will be reduced to inconsequentiality. I used to be the person whom Dad trusted the most. I always sat on his right-hand side, where it was more convenient to talk to Dad and report things to and get opinions from him. But now, my position in his heart seems to have been shaken. Even a junior is entitled to take my seat. I can't stand this anymore." Thinking of this, Damien shot a frosty glance at Miley, his sanity stopping him from hitting back at Miley now, but the icy look in his eyes was all too apparent. When he first married this woman from the Rogers family, he thought it would help him in his career. But now, it seemed that she was not of much help. Miley was frightened by his glance, but she did not understand why. "What exactly is Damien mad at me for? I said this out of concern, just wanting him to take a good rest." Thinking of this, Miley looked a little aggrieved. Karen almost wanted to laugh out loud at Miley's stupidity. She turned to whisper something to Dylan, and Dylan snickered. Feeling not too happy with Karen's triumphant attitude, Miley shot a glare at her. "No matter how proud Karen is, there is one thing that she can never beat. My daughter is miles better than Karen's." Karen said that Harvey of the Ellison family and Snow were a couple, but that is no sign of anything happening yet. In contrast, Chloe has already gotten a role in Nichelle's movie. But unbeknownst to Miley, Chloe had not dared to tell her that Nichelle had dropped her from the role. So when Miley thought of her precious daughter, she felt much better. She snorted at Karen and then turned to whisper to Damien. "Don't get angry. Chloe said she'd be invited to dinner with Nichelle in a few days. Do you think we should also go along?" Damien turned his head around and squinted at his cautious-looking wife upon hearing her mention Nichelle. "How did Chloe get Nichelle's invitation?" he asked. Miley thought for a moment and said, "It seems to have something to do with my mother. She spent a lot of money to get an invitation to the banquet at Nichelle's house and planned to send Chloe over to build rapport with Nichelle." Only then did Damien look straight at Miley with a light flashing in his eyes behind the gold-framed eyeglasses. "How many invitations have you got there?" he asked. Nicole introduced all her brothers to Mrs. Wallace Sr. over dinner. Mrs. Wallace Sr. looked at the twin siblings of Spencer and Samuel and smiled. "You two seem to have the best relationship with Nicole, right?" Both Spencer and Samuel had been fetching Nicole food during dinner as if afraid that she could not eat enough. She knew very well that the adults sitting here were mere of formality. Those kids who were willing to come back and meet an old lady like her were the ones really having a good relationship with Nicole. Samuel nodded in response. He was extra gentle in front of Mrs. Wallace Sr. That's for sure. Nicole and I are buddies. Spencer smirked. Just as he was about to say something, Nicole suddenly said solemnly, "Yes, Samuel is the most cheerful and the one closest to me. He is impulsive, but he is a good guy." Again, Spencer tittered upon hearing that, not giving Samuel a face. Samuel's face darkened instantly. While he tried to make a good impression on Mrs. Wallace Sr., Spencer, even Nicole, were rocking the boat. He looked up with some displeasure. "Hey Nicole, you're too much." Nicole did not let him finish. She looked at Mrs. Wallace Sr. with a serious face. "He's a good brother though." Mrs. Wallace Sr. could not help but smile and nod. She could see that Nicole was really close to her brothers, and they seemed to be getting along well. Mr. Riddle Sr. could not help but smile upon hearing what Nicole said. As if he suddenly thought of something, he quickly put up a serious face again. "I don't care what you all do on normal days, but you all must not let your grades slip. Do you all understand?" Mrs. Wallace Sr. looked at Nicole with some surprise as if trying to say something. But Nicole just nodded nonchalantly. "Don't worry, I will," she said solemnly. Only then did Mr. Riddle Sr.'s face brighten up. After he had finished eating, he instructed the servants to prepare a room for Mrs. Wallace Sr., but Mrs. Wallace Sr. declined. "I really appreciate your hospitality, but I'm going back to Great Oak." "Thank you, anyway." Nicole looked at Mrs. Wallace Sr., but there was nothing she could do. She knew her grandmother did not like to bother others and was adamant about leaving. Mr. Riddle Sr. was nonplussed for a second and then sighed. "Since this is the case, I will ask the chauffeur to send you back when you leave." Mrs. Wallace Sr. nodded in thanks, and Nicole had no objection. Sean suddenly said, "I'll send Mrs. Wallace Sr. home." Mr. Riddle Sr. nodded. "Okay, but make sure you take care of the guest." Sean nodded, promising to complete the task. Mr. Riddle Sr. then went upstairs, leaving the others to dine with Mrs. Wallace Sr. In their father's absence, Dylan and his wife could not bother to entertain those whom they saw as inferior. They also went upstairs to retire for the day. Damien and Miley did not look too patient either. They quickly finished their meal and went to see Mr. Riddle Sr. Now, only Daniel and his wife remained to entertain Mrs. Wallace Sr. An hour later, Mrs. Wallace Sr. saw that the time was almost up and got to her feet. "It's getting late now. I have got to go. Please take good care of Nicole, Mr. and Mrs. Riddle," she said to Damien and Gloria. It was her only wish. "Don't worry. We will." Gloria nodded to assure her. Nicole was touched. Apparently, her grandmother was afraid that she could not get used to living here and came to see if she was okay. She knew it. It was still Mrs. Wallace Sr. who cared for her the most. Daniel, his wife, and their children saw Nicole and Mrs. Wallace Sr. out. As they came out of the door, Sean drove over a low-key but luxurious Mercedes-Benz. This Mercedes-Benz's sports sedan was well known for its comfort. Sean chose the car with Mrs. Wallace Sr. in mind. Nicole raised an eyebrow as she watched Sean get out of the car and open the door for Mrs. Wallace Sr., then waited until her grandmother had gotten in before he returned to the driver's seat. Nicole was touched by his heartwarming gesture. Sean might be taciturn, but he was very thoughtful. Not wanting to delay further, Nicole also got into the car and sat next to her grandmother. Great Oak was about a 2.5 to 3 hour drive from here. Time passed quickly as the three of them chatted all the way. Arriving at the destination and before getting out of the car, Mrs. Wallace Sr. looked at Nicole and felt reluctant to leave. Sean saw this and gave them a little more time, motioning for Nicole to send her grandmother upstairs while he waited downstairs. As Nicole and her grandmother entered the house, Mrs. Wallace Sr. took Nicole's hand and asked anxiously, "Tell me the truth, why did Mr. Riddle Sr. say your grades had slipped? Was it because you were distracted since coming to San Joto?" Nicole smiled, not expecting Mrs. Wallace Sr. to be still mindful of it. "No, there is no exam yet. He doesn't know what my grades are. He's just worried. Mrs. Wallace Sr. was relieved. She exhorted Nicole and patted her hand as if thinking of something. Before this, I was worried that the Riddle family would not be able to accept you, but after I saw your parents and brothers, and they're all good to you, I'm at ease. You don't have to worry about me again. Just take good care of yourself. She did not tell her grandmother that she had again transferred some money to her grandmother's bank account while they were on the way back. I know, Mrs. Wallace Sr. said with a smile. She suddenly thought of Jared and said, "You are not small any longer. If you meet someone you like, open your eyes wide. I think the guy who sent us home in the afternoon is not half bad at all." Mrs. Wallace Sr. did not wish Nicole to find someone wealthy, but she really liked Jared. Nicole was slightly startled and blushing. She could not help but ask back, "You like him? What exactly did Jared do to my grandmother that she likes him so much?" Nicole asked in her mind. Mrs. Wallace Sr. thought for a moment and then said calmly, "He is very polite, speaks pleasantly, and I can see that he is gentle with you and in his manners." Nicole raised an eyebrow. Edwin is also a gentleman, right? She still felt that her grandmother was biased toward Jared. Mrs. Wallace Sr. waved her hand impatiently. "Are you making fun of me?" Seeing that she was busted, Nicole stopped asking. She got up and waved at Mrs. Wallace Sr. "You must be tired. Rest early. When I'm done with the monthly exam, I'll come back to see you when I have time." Having seen her grandmother today and knowing that she was still healthy, Nicole felt much at ease. "Okay." Mrs. Wallace Sr. smiled gently. Nicole returned a smile and then left. Downstairs, Sean was still standing by the car. When he saw Nicole come back out, he opened the door and signaled for her to hurry up. Nicole wasted no time in getting into the back seat, and Sean jumped back into the driver's seat, held the steering wheel with one hand, and loosened the tie with the other. Nicole could not help but feel grateful when she saw that. "Thank you for waiting, Sean." "No, it's just that the sun is bigger and hotter now." Sean smiled. "How's your grandma? Did she ask you to stay?" Nicole looked into the big eyes in the rearview mirror and nodded affirmatively. "No, she asked me to get along with you. It seems that your grandma is very happy with us." Sean breathed a sigh of relief. He started the car and drove back towards San Giotto. Nicole was bored and glanced at her phone. Suddenly, she received a text message from Edwin. "Please, help me find that master. If he doesn't show up, I'll be done for." Nicole raised an eyebrow. In fact, she and Edwin did not know each other well, but this morning he took her grandmother on a tour of the school, and he was indeed considerate. So she considered she owed him a favor. She just did not know why he was looking for Lucifer. Looking up at Sean, she mused for a moment and then asked Sean, "Do you know Edwin?" "Edwin?" Sean wondered for a second. "Is it the guy from the Bradford family, the one who started a hacking company with Preston?" Nicole knew that aside from having a business relationship with Harvey, Edwin also seemed to be close to Preston at school. But she did not know that the two of them actually had a hacking company. "There should have only one Edwin in the school," Nicole said in a whisper. "That's him." Sean's eyes darkened suddenly. "I'm not very familiar with Preston and the Bradford guy, but recently I got the wind that they had got a tricky job, which I heard they accepted without knowing the client's background. If they fail, their company will collapse and maybe implicate the Riddle family as well. Recently, Riddle Corporation had been fighting with the McCarthy family for land, and Sean had not looked into it carefully. Oh? Will things really implicate the Riddle family? That was a surprise to Nicole. She did not mean to help Edwin, but if it affected the Riddle family, it would be another story. After all, she also knew that things were not looking up for the Riddle family recently. "Yeah, I haven't had time to do much digging lately. How come you and Edwin know each other so well?" Sean glanced inquisitively at her. "I don't know him well," Nicole said without hesitation. She wanted nothing to do with the people around Harvey. "Okay." Sean asked nothing more and drove silently. Meanwhile, Nicole secretly contacted Zeke on her phone. After all, since the last time he had given her a job, things seemed to have something to do with it. She was stunned to see that F logo after some digging. No way. Is Rowan the one who is behind this mission? Now, Nicole had no reason not to help. Sean drove Nicole back to San Giotto, expecting her to go back to the campus since her monthly exams were just around the corner. But Nicole wanted to go back to the mansion first. So Sean sent her home before he drove back to the office. As soon as Nicole stepped into the house, she saw Preston sitting in the dining room typing on his laptop. They had not talked much to each other, but he was also her cousin. When her second uncle's family singled out her and her parents several times previously, Preston had remained silent, which showed that he was still a decent person. Nicole went around Preston's back without making a sound. Preston was fixing some tricky code. The backup system was breaking apart little by little, and if something went wrong, he had to fix it right away, or the destruction would speed up.
Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.